Well, welcome to our second section on the teacher work sample called Instructional Design. And in this section, we're going to start to look at the specific range of objectives that you'll be using, how they're aligned with the state standards, what assessments you're going to use, like your pre-test and your post-test, the different formative assessments you use to check to see how they're doing as you teach the unit, what multiple learning strategies that you've got planned, and then how you might integrate three things such as technology, reading, and other subjects, integration of curriculum, and then finally how you might adapt or differentiate instruction for different types of kids. So this is what your rubric looks like as we analyze Section 2, Instructional Design. The very first thing in Section 2 is a narrative asking you to write about your objectives and why you chose those objectives. It is usually explaining your range of objectives and why you chose them and what they're trying to do to meet state standards or national standards. Again, when we talk about objectives, you'll be looking at the three types: the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor objectives in our chapter readings, and then how the taxonomy is used, especially the types of verbs that are associated with writing objectives for each of those standards. What you'll do in section B is, after you've written why you chose these objectives, you'll state them and then list on the taxonomy what level they are on. In essence, all your objectives will be written. Students will be able to, and you tell us what they're going to be able to do at the end of the unit. Hopefully, you will have basic level knowledge at the beginning, how they're going to apply it and how they might analyze it or evaluate it as you move up the spectrum. You can also use affective objectives and psychomotor. So in essence, your unit will look at what the student will be able to know, what they should be able to believe, and then what skills they should be able to have mastered at the end of the unit. Now, not many units will have all three of those area domains covered in a unit, but try your best to see if you could use all three. Again, the table, sometimes we make a mistake in writing the objectives as listing them as activities, like students will take a test on. Well, that's more of an activity and not what they're going to know or believe or be able to skill that they'll be able to do at the end of the unit. And each objective should directly be reflected in some sort of assessment. For example, if you list these 5 objectives, there ought to be in the pre-test and post-test and in the various formative assessments a way to show that you're covering each of these objectives so that none are left out. So as you write these, think about how you're going to assess them in the end. Here's an example, typically of what this work sample had 9 different objectives, but notice they're written as students will be able to, and they can move from knowledge to evaluation, which they were all in the cognitive area, but they moved to almost all of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And if you don't know Bloom's taxonomy yet, you will become very aware of those as we look at, I think it's the second chapter of our reading. The third thing you'll be asked to do is connect them to state standards or national standards, or could even, if you're teaching in a certain district that have benchmarks, curriculum benchmarks, you could connect them to those. So somehow they have to be connected to something bigger than just your unit. Kansas standards are listed, and again, we will have these in the various modules where you can go, but if you notice, we go to the Kansas State Department again, look at the Kansas standards, and we have these for almost any area you're going to teach. So you're kind of look through the standard in your area and decide which ones you're going to address with your unit. Again, Missouri and Oklahoma. And if you're not in one of these three states, every state department has their standards listed on their State Department page. If you have trouble finding those, you can always email me and I'll help you find it. In C, this is typically how it looks. Your list, the standard. Most have then a benchmark. So your list of standard, the benchmark, what those objectives, in this last girl's case, her 7 different objectives will apply to one of, at least one of these 3 types of standards. And then below, she will explain how her objective addresses those standards. So we've got to make a connection to what your district wants you to teach. The gist of almost the entire teacher work sample is part C. Once you get this done, everything falls into place. This chart is quite, it's the lengthiest thing kind of you're due, but it sort of plans your entire unit in one little graph. For example, you will list your pretest. Usually it's on day 1. And your list the date that you taught it, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it will cover what objectives that you're going to measure, and hopefully it'll be most of the objectives, but the pretest will be the same as the post-test. And then what you'll do is list as you go through your lessons, like on day 2, how you're going to teach it. You'll briefly list the instructional strategies, the things you're going to do, and what technology you use. If you use technology, oh boy, did I skip? If you use technology, you'll put a T there in that little box. If you're going to use a reading strategy where you actually teach a kid or your class a specific reading strategy, you put an R. And if you integrate the curriculum, if you teach something from another curriculum, you'll use that I to indicate that you're going to integrate curriculum in that lesson. And so that kind of gives us an indication that you're using those 3. In the formative assessments, you kind of list what they are, describe if you're using Kahoot or a quiz or a game. It could be an essay or journal entry or a performance rubric. Whatever it is, you kind of list how you're using that as a formative assessment. And then if there are any adaptations, like the fictional class had 2 learning disabled students, what might you do to adapt anything that you're going to do with students that might need some sort of modification or accommodation. So what it looks like here's an example. If you notice, this is a 10-day unit, and she's using technology on the first day. She's doing some reading instruction here and integration. In fact, she uses that quite often. And then She tells us what objectives. Now, normally I would just write down the number of the objective there, so you don't have to. And you see, most of the examples will have just the number of the objective going back to your previous thing, so you don't have to write it out. But here's brief instructional strategy. The formal or types of assessment she's going to use, and then how she did it. So basically, that's kind of the gist of your course. In table 2.2, you're going to look at your different pre and post test and your formative assessments. We're going to ask that at least you have 2 of them. There could be many more, but the more variety of informal and formal assessments you have, probably the stronger the unit is in assessing whether or not your kids are learning what they're supposed to learn. But they come in a variety of forms, such as portfolios, quizzes, short answer essays. It could even be teacher observations using a rubric, especially if you're PE. It could be a performance assessment, again using a rubric, or it could even be students grading themselves and self-reflections. But in this section, you're going to clearly describe how you use the assessment and why you're using it here, why you're going to use that, explain how the assessment's measuring what, and how it's going to help you decide whether or not to reteach or to go on. Each of these assessments should be aligned to the objective. So in essence, if you have 7 objectives, I ought to see all 7 objectives kind of listed someplace in here as you use the formative assessments. On the objectives for the pre and post should all be the same because it's the same test. So that kind of analyzes your instructional design for your assessments. Here's an example of it. Notice how she's using the number of the objective here. That saves you a heck of a lot of time. And she's got a Kagan activity quiz and the like. So she tells us how the assessment was graded and used and the likes. Simple, but it kind of in a simple way tells us your assessment system. Then following that, you have probably 10 questions that you're going to answer, like why was the lesson sequenced like this? What learning strategies did you incorporate? What learning strategies or activities did address specific objectives? How did you incorporate critical thinking or problem solving in your lesson? What reading strategies did you use? Now, if you're a PE lesson, music, you're probably not going to have many reading strategies. So, don't force it. And many of them just won't have a whole lot of reading strategies that you're going to use. PE might be hard to incorporate technology, but if you could even tell us that you use technology to get certain lesson plans or certain videos or the like. It always doesn't have to be student directed, how the student uses it. And then how you integrated some parts of the curriculum in what you were teaching. And lastly, did you adapt to accommodate or help a child in a different way from somebody else? How did you differentiate for certain types of kid to accommodate learning needs? If you had any of that, explain it there. And then what adaptations and modifications were used to accommodate. So this one kind of explains what you did. And as best you can, try to include the teaching and reading, technology usage, and integration of other curriculum areas. And sometimes those are real hard to get in, so don't worry if you don't get them, all 3 of those in. Here's what it might look like. Some are a lot longer than this, typically a little bit more, but wanted to get it on one page. But you'll see almost two dozen different examples, so you can see how different students in different areas such as music or technology or social science, family, consumer science, almost any of the areas, how they answered those questions, details on the prompts. If you don't have a classroom, again, you're going to use the addendum in section 2 that will talk about how you might kind of make up on the two special students, what adaptations you could give them a special learning problem and adapt it there. Some of it would be kind of fictitious, but what might occur, most of this is your planning, what you plan to do. So like your teaching strategies, most everything other than that adaptations and accommodations will apply to section 2. Again, just you go back and use those subgroups to identify and make up anything that you might have to make up, just to show that you were thinking that direction. In the attachments, and we'll talk about these later, they will ask that you give 2 complete detailed lesson plans, and we'll be looking at lesson planning, what the formats will look like. But again, you want to include 2 well-developed lesson plans that you used during your lesson. So next time we'll talk about section 3, actual teaching of your unit plan, and we'll get into desegregation data and mainly your assessment. So get busy. Good luck. If you have questions, just give me a call.